I am Olivia Bennett, 36 years old, and on the day I was supposed to marry the man I love, my sister Amanda stood at the hotel doors blocking every guest from entering. The look on my daughter Sophie's face as she clung to me while whispers spread that my wedding was canceled will never leave me. I had spent my life swallowing my sister's cruelty. But this time, I called the FBI, and in front of 200 people, they dragged her away. I woke to the quiet hum of the city and the pale light stretching through the curtains of my suite at the Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston. My first thought was not of the dress waiting in the corner or the flowers arranged on the table. It was in my chest. Today, I was supposed to marry Daniel Carter, the man who had carried me through storms I thought would break me. Before I could sit up, Sophie leapt onto the bed, her curls bouncing as she laughed. She was 9, all energy and innocence. She wrapped her arms around my neck and whispered if Aunt Amanda was going to be there today. My smile was quick, too quick, and I brushed her hair back, telling her not to worry. But my stomach tightened. Amanda had a way of showing up when I least wanted her to, and she had never once allowed me a day free from her shadow. I slipped from the bed and helped Sophie into her lilac dress. She twirled in front of the mirror, oblivious to the dread tugging at me. The bouquet of roses smelled sweet, almost cloying, and I forced myself to breathe it in as if it could steady me. I tried to believe this day would be different. By late morning, I was ready. The dress slid against my skin like water, my hair pinned just so, every detail curated for a memory I thought I would cherish. I held Sophie's hand and walked with her down to the lobby. The marble floor gleamed under the chandeliers. Voices floated in pockets of excitement, and for a brief moment, I let myself smile at the sight of familiar faces arriving. That calm lasted less than a minute. Jason Miller, the hotel's event manager, hurried toward me. His expression was pale, his voice pitched low but urgent. There was a woman at the main entrance refusing to let guests in. She claimed she was my sister. My breath caught. I asked him to describe her, though I did not need to. Auburn hair tied tight, a voice sharp enough to cut. Amanda. Jason shifted uncomfortably, explaining that several guests had already turned away in frustration. More were bunched outside, confused whispering. Through the revolving glass doors, I saw them, a cluster of suits and dresses, held back by a single figure who stood tall and immovable. My pulse hammered in my ears. I adjusted the strap of my gown to keep my hands from shaking. Sophie tugged at my arm, her small voice barely audible, asking if something was wrong. I forced a smile that did not reach my eyes and told her it was fine. Inside, I was unraveling. This was not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. This was Amanda. She had never been content with her own spotlight, unless mine was snuffed out, and now she was doing it again on the one day that was supposed to belong to me. I straightened my back, the silk of my gown whispering with the movement. Around me, guests began murmuring, their glances turning sharp, questioning. I caught a glimpse of someone shaking their head, already reaching for their phone, maybe to call a car and leave. The roses that once smelled sweet now clung to the air like a mockery. Sophie pressed closer to me, sensing what I did not say. I squeezed her hand as much to comfort her as to keep myself from breaking. My lips curved into another smile, practiced and brittle, while inside my heart thundered. The wedding had not even started, and already Amanda had found a way to poison it. I knew this was not the end of her game. It was only the beginning. The noise from the lobby swelled, voices rising and breaking like waves against glass. And in that moment, an old memory cut through me with the same sting it had carried for years. It was 2015, the winter after Sophie had turned 1. I had been working double shifts at the community hospital, putting every spare dollar into a savings account for her college fund. $50,000. I remember holding that bank statement in my hand, proud in a way I had never been allowed to be. For once, I thought I had built something that no one could take from me. Then my parents called. My father Richard was 62, then his voice always heavy with finality, and my mother Evelyn at 58 was just as sharp and insistent. Amanda wanted to buy a condo in Cambridge, and the bank would not approve her mortgage without a larger down payment. They told me I should give her my savings. Not lend, give, because she was starting her life and I had always been the responsible one. I remember sitting at the small kitchen table of my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between their words. I tried to protest, telling them this money was for Sophie's future, but Evelyn cut me off, her tone sweet and poisonous. You can always earn it back. Amanda needs it now. She deserves a fresh start. That night I cried quietly on the bathroom floor, so Sophie would not hear. In the end, I transferred the money because I was too afraid of severing the fragile link I still had with them. They had raised me on lessons carved deep into my bones. Older sisters give way. Strong daughters manage on their own. Amanda needed to be protected, praised, celebrated. I needed to be quiet, dependable, invisible. The sound of Sophie's laugh pulled me back, then the tiny sound of her hand slapping against the tub as I bathed her. Even as my tears blurred my sight, I told myself it was worth it. I could live with being overlooked if she never had to feel the sting I carried. Now, standing in the grand lobby with Sophie's small fingers gripping mine, that memory pressed against my chest like a weight I could not shake. She looked up at me, her wide eyes filled with questions she did not ask. All she knew was that her mother was trembling and the air was tight with whispers. I recognized the fear in her because I had worn it myself for as long as I could remember. Every success I had scraped together had been dismissed. When I graduated college with honors, my parents stayed home because Amanda had a small modeling show the same night. When I earned a promotion at the hospital, they barely glanced at the email I forwarded yet. When Amanda landed a temporary job as an event assistant, they called it brilliance. It was a lifetime of erasure, and today it was repeating now, aimed at Sophie through me. I bent down and kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair as I whispered that she was safe. But inside, fury built like a storm. Amanda was not just blocking my guests. She was trying to erase me in front of the very people who mattered most, turning my wedding into another stage where I was expected to disappear. The murmur outside grew louder, a ripple of agitation spilling into the marble hall. Jason returned, his face pale, telling me security was struggling to keep control at the entrance. I felt Sophie clutch tighter, and I knew this was no longer only about me. If I stayed silent again, if I allowed Amanda to crush this day, then Sophie would grow up learning the same cruel lesson I had been taught, that her worth could be stolen, her joy eclipsed, her place in the world denied. I straightened, my pulse sharp and steady now. I was done being the quiet one. Whatever came next, I would not let Sophie inherit the shame that had been forced on me. I turned toward the doors where the crowd was thickening, bracing myself for what I already knew I had to face. The sound hit me before I reached the doors, a chorus of phones buzzing and sharp voices cutting through the marble air. Guests were staring at their screens, some whispering, others looking directly at me with suspicion. A man in a navy suit muttered that the wedding was canceled, his wife clutching her purse like she was already planning to leave. My stomach clenched as another woman stepped closer, showing me the text she had just received. It read that the ceremony was called off because I could not pay for it. Heat rushed to my face, shame and anger colliding inside me. Jason Miller appeared at my side, his voice low but urgent. He said Amanda had locked the side entrance and was shouting at the security staff. She threatened to sue the hotel if anyone let the guests in. I pressed a hand to my temple, fighting the dizzying swirl of humiliation. Around us, conversations grew louder, heads turned, eyes sharp with judgment. I saw Nancy Collins, a local journalist I'd invited out of courtesy, pull out her phone and begin recording. Her gaze was steady, her expression unreadable, but I knew the footage would not be kind. The rows of chairs that had been neatly arranged inside the ballroom were already half empty. Guests drifted toward the doors, hesitating, unsure if they should stay. The energy in the room shifted from celebration to doubt, and it cut me to the bone. Sophie tugged at my sleeve, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. She asked if the wedding was really canceled. I dropped to my knees and held her shoulders, forcing a smile that tasted bitter in my mouth. I told her everything was fine, that nothing was canceled, but my chest burned with fury. How could Amanda twist the knife this way, knowing Sophie was watching? knowing she was turning my daughter's joy into fear. I stood again, straightening the fabric of my gown, trying to look composed, even as my insides screamed. The whispers circled me like vultures. A guest shook his head and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing against the floor like a final judgment. Another couple followed, their faces stiff with embarrassment, as if my humiliation was contagious. Jason leaned close, telling me the hotel staff were doing their best to hold the entrance, but Amanda was relentless, hurling accusations and demanding that the doors remain shut. Each word spread like wildfire, feeding the rumors that the wedding was nothing but a farce. I clenched my fists at my sides, the silk gloves tight around my fingers. For a moment, I let my eyes close just long enough to feel the weight of all the years behind me. Every time Amanda had pushed me down, and my parents had allowed it. But when I opened them, the sight of Sophie wiping her tears hardened something inside me. This day would not end in defeat. I moved toward the center of the ballroom, standing tall, so that every pair of eyes fixed on me. I told the guests the ceremony was still happening, that there was no cancellation, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. Some listened. Others shook their heads, already poisoned by Amanda's lies. The air was heavy, every breath thick with doubt and tension. Out beyond the glass doors, I caught a glimpse of Amanda's figure, her arms crossed, her posture defiant, as if she were the rightful owner of my day. The sight fueled the fire in my veins. She wanted me broken, humiliated, begging. I tightened my grip on Sophie's hand and whispered that we would get through this together. Her small nod was all I needed to steady myself. The ballroom had become a theater of whispers and judgment, but I refused to be erased. What Amanda had started outside was spilling inside, threatening to collapse everything, and deep down I knew she was only getting started. I searched the crowded room until I found my parents near the back, their expressions tight, watching the chaos unfold as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience. Relief flickered in me for a second. Surely they would help set things right. I walked quickly toward them, Sophie clinging to my side, my gown trailing behind me. My voice cracked as I asked them to step in to tell Amanda to stop before everything was ruined. My mother Evelyn's eyes swept over me with that familiar mix of disdain and superiority. She shook her head slowly and said Amanda was only protecting the family's dignity, that I should accept it and stop embarrassing us further. The words landed like a slap. I stared at her, waiting for my father to correct her, to remind her this was my wedding day. But Richard remained silent, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the floor, as though I was a stranger, not his daughter. The noise of the guests blurred around me. All I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears and the pounding of my own heart. My throat tightened. I could barely breathe. I asked them if they understood what they were saying, that Amanda was destroying the most important day of my life, that Sophie was watching. Evelyn's mouth curved into a thin line. She said I was overreacting, that Amanda always had the family's best interest in mind. Before I could respond, Amanda appeared at their side. She wore a fitted navy dress, her posture straight, her smile sharp enough to cut. She leaned close, her voice low but dripping with venom, telling me I was foolish to think I deserved happiness, that she would never let me have a day that was mine alone. Her eyes glittered with satisfaction as she watched the color drain from my face. Sophie's sob broke through the moment, high and piercing. She buried her face against my waist, her small body trembling. I wrapped my arms around her, my hands shaking as I tried to shield her from Amanda's stare. Anger and despair twisted inside me until they were indistinguishable. I looked from Amanda's smug face to my parents' blank ones and realized there was no one left to turn to. This was not simply sabotage. This was betrayal. It was a public declaration that I was alone, that they would stand with Amanda, even if it meant watching me fall. A cold certainty settled in my chest. Whatever bond I thought I had with them had died right here in the lobby of the hotel, under the eyes of hundreds of guests. Amanda tilted her head and smirked, as though daring me to fight back. My mother placed a hand on Amanda's arm in silent support, and my father still would not meet my eyes. The shame cut deep, but beneath it something stronger began to rise. I pulled Sophie closer and lifted my chin, refusing to let Amanda see me crumble. The ballroom around us buzzed with whispers, the air thick with judgment. Every instinct screamed at me to collapse, to scream, to beg for some scrap of decency from the people who had raised me. But another voice, steadier, louder, told me the time for begging was over. I had lost the family I was born into. But in that loss, a new resolve took root. If they could turn their backs on me in the moment I needed them most, then I no longer owed them my silence or my submission. Sophie deserved a mother who fought back, not one who bowed her head. I kissed the top of her head and smoothed her curls, whispering that she was safe, even as Amanda's laughter echoed faintly behind me. My hands were trembling, but my steps grew surer as I turned away from them. If my own blood would not stand for me, then I would find another way. And in that moment I began to understand that the fight was no longer just about my wedding. It was about every injustice I had swallowed for years, and I was done swallowing. Emily found me before I had the chance to catch my breath. Her cheeks were pale and her voice shook as she gripped my arm. She said Amanda was telling people that Daniel had been drowning in debt, that this wedding was nothing but a cover-up. My stomach dropped so fast it felt like the floor had vanished. Around us, heads leaned close, whispers turned sharp, and I caught fragments of words that pierced me like knives. Debt. Fake. Shame. I turned to Daniel. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with something between anger and humiliation. He told me quietly to ignore it, that people would see through Amanda's lies, but I could see the pain beneath his steady voice. This was no longer just my burden. She was trying to humiliate him too, to tear apart the man who had done nothing but love me. The guests' murmurs grew louder, thick with suspicion. A group of his co-workers stood stiffly by the bar, their eyes flicking between their phones and Daniel's face. I wanted to scream, to drag Amanda inside and make her answer for every word, but I knew that was what she wanted, for me to explode and confirm the spectacle she had created. My phone buzzed in my palm. A message lit the screen from Daniel Price, the attorney who had always been more friend than professional contact. His words were sharp. "You need to call the FBI. This is no longer a family matter. She has disrupted a licensed event, threatened security, blocked access. This is criminal." My pulse spiked. My first thought was disbelief. Reporting my own sister to federal agents felt unthinkable, but the chaos around me left no doubt. I looked at Sophie. Her small face was blotchy from tears, her lip trembling as she clung to the skirt of my gown. I knew she was absorbing every moment, every whisper, and one day she would remember whether her mother had caved or stood tall. I swallowed hard, the bitterness sharp in my throat. For years I had chosen silence, telling myself it was easier, telling myself peace was worth the cost. But silence had only fed Amanda's cruelty, had only taught her she could take and take until there was nothing left. Daniel reached for my hand. His grip was steady, even as his eyes betrayed the sting of what had been said. He told me he would stand with me no matter what. That one sentence was enough to steady my lungs, to stop the shaking in my knees. Emily squeezed my shoulder and told me I had to act now, before the lies spread any further. I looked around at the faces, at the doubt clouding the air like smoke. Amanda had lit a fire, and it was devouring everything in its path. If I did not put it out, there would be nothing left to save. I lifted my phone again, my thumb hovering over the call button. My mind flashed through every sacrifice I had made, every time I had been told to be the bigger person, every time Amanda had been excused because she was fragile or special. Rage and clarity fused into one. This was no longer about protecting her or appeasing my parents. This was about protecting myself, Daniel, and Sophie. I drew in a breath that burned in my chest and pressed the button. As the ringtone sounded in my ear, I met Daniel's eyes and saw the flicker of relief mixed with fear. Around us, the noise of the ballroom swelled, guests, waiting, watching, feeding on the chaos. When the line clicked open and the agent's voice answered, I felt my heart steady. My voice was low but firm as I began to explain what Amanda had done. This was the moment I had always avoided, the step I had always been too afraid to take. And as the words left my mouth, I realized there was no turning back. The agent on the other end of the line asked me for details, and I gave them all, my voice steadier with every word. Amanda was blocking the entrance of the hotel, refusing to let guests in, threatening security staff, and spreading lies that the event had been canceled. This was a licensed wedding with signed contracts, I told them, and she was endangering everyone inside and outside. The agent assured me a team was already nearby and would respond immediately. When I hung up, the sound of shouting reached a new pitch outside. Guests pressed against the glass doors, some filming, others arguing with each other in confusion. A man in a gray blazer yelled that this was ridiculous, that he was leaving. His wife tried to pull him back, but he stormed away, shaking his head. The ripples spread through the crowd, tension vibrating in the air like static before a storm. Sophie clung to my arm, burying her face against me. Her small voice trembled, asking if the police were coming to take us away. I knelt and told her no, that help was coming to protect us, that she had nothing to fear. She nodded, though her eyes still glistened with tears. I kissed her cheek and rose just as Jason Miller returned, sweat beading on his forehead. He said Amanda had locked the side door with a chain she had pulled from her bag, that security had tried to reason with her, but she threatened to call lawyers to ruin the hotel's reputation if anyone touched her. The swell of voices outside broke into a roar as black SUVs pulled up to the curb. The FBI agents stepped out quickly, their jackets catching the light, their presence cutting through the chaos like a blade. Guests pulled back, murmurs rising into gasps. Phones lifted higher, dozens of lenses capturing the moment. Through the glass, I saw Amanda's face twist, her arms crossed tightly, her mouth moving fast as she shouted at the agents. I could not hear the words, but I knew the tone, the same sneer she had used on me since we were children. She pointed toward the doors, toward me, her voice carrying just enough for the words to hit. She said I was unworthy, that I did not deserve to stand at the altar. The agents listened to the hotel staff, to the security guards, who confirmed Amanda's threats. Jason stood stiff beside them, his hands gesturing to the locked door, his voice clear, as he explained how she had endangered everyone. Amanda's protest grew louder, her body thrashing, when one of the agents stepped closer. The crowd gasped as she shoved against them, her voice sharp with panic. Then the cuffs clicked. Amanda's wrists were pulled behind her back, her body stiffening as she shouted that this was a mistake, that they would regret it. Evelyn broke from the crowd and rushed forward, crying out her daughter's name, pleading with the agents to let her go. Richard stood frozen, his face drained of color, unable to move or speak. The sight of my parents unraveling under the eyes of 200 guests should have felt like vindication, but instead it felt strangely quiet inside me, a hollow space where grief and relief collided. The ballroom erupted with noise, some guests gasping, others cheering softly under their breath, as though glad someone had finally stopped her. Nancy Collins was scribbling notes furiously, her phone raised in the other hand, recording every second. I lifted Sophie into my arms, her small frame pressing against me. For the first time all day, I felt the crushing weight on my chest begin to ease. I whispered in her ear that we were safe now, that nothing could take this day from us. Yet as Amanda was led away, her eyes still locked on mine, burning with hatred, I knew this was not the end. It was only the next step in a battle that would not be won so easily. The lobby grew eerily quiet after the doors closed behind the agents. The crowd shifted, whispers filling the silence like the rustle of dry leaves. My heart still hammered, but I felt a steadiness in my chest that had been missing all day. I stepped forward to the center of the ballroom, the click of my heels echoing in the hush, and lifted my chin. My voice carried further than I thought it could, as I told everyone the ceremony would go on, that this was my day and no one could take it from me. For a moment there was nothing. Then hands clapped together, one pair, then another, until the sound grew into a wave of applause. People rose from their seats, some cheering softly, others nodding with approval. I caught sight of Daniel at the front, his eyes shining with relief and pride. Sophie clapped too, her small hands quick and eager, her smile trembling but real. Nancy Collins slipped closer to me, her notebook in one hand, her phone still recording in the other. She leaned in and murmured that people needed to hear this story, that it was not just a wedding, but a truth about families, about the power to stand up when no one else will. Her words settled deep inside me, heavier than I expected. Jason Miller approached with 2 FBI agents. In his hand was a phone, Amanda's phone, which she had dropped in the scuffle. He said it had been unlocked when they picked it up, and the screen was still glowing. One of the agents explained that it would be taken into custody as evidence, but before it was sealed, Jason showed me the last messages. My breath caught as I read the words Amanda bragging to a friend that she would make my wedding collapse, that the city would know it had all been a farce, that I would leave in disgrace. The proof was there in black and white, undeniable. The weight of humiliation I had carried for hours began to crack. Around me, the same guests who had whispered doubt now whispered something else, shaking their heads in disbelief. A woman muttered that Amanda had gone too far. A man behind her said justice had finally come due. I turned and saw my parents. Evelyn's eyes were wide but hard, her mouth pressed thin. Richard stared at the floor, his shoulders sagging under invisible weight. Neither of them moved to defend Amanda, not now, not with evidence laid bare. The relatives who had once fawned over my sister shifted away from them, their gazes sharp with judgment. For the first time in my life, I saw shame etched across my parents' faces, and it was not mine to carry. Daniel reached for my hand, his grip warm and sure. The simple contact steadied me, reminding me that this day was not ruined, that love was still here standing with me. I let out a breath I had been holding since dawn and felt a fragile smile tug at my lips. Sophie looked up at me, her eyes wide with relief. She whispered if it was really over. I pulled her close and told her we were safe. But inside, I knew the story was not finished. Amanda's hatred would not vanish with a pair of handcuffs. As the guests slowly settled back into their seats and the agent stepped outside, I felt the shift in the room. I was no longer the woman they pitied or doubted. I was the woman who had taken back her day in front of them all. Still, a quiet unease lingered beneath the surface. Evidence and applause did not erase decades of wounds. The ceremony was about to begin again, but I could not shake the thought that the real reckoning had only just begun. Daniel squeezed my hand as the music began again, softer this time, almost tentative. Sophie walked down the aisle with a basket of petals, her small arms swinging as if determined to reclaim the joy that had been stolen earlier. The guests clapped for her, the sound warm, and her smile finally bloomed across her face. When she reached the front, she looked back at me, and I knew she understood that the storm had passed, at least for now. I stepped forward, the silk of my dress brushing against the polished floor, and took my place beside Daniel. His voice cracked slightly as he read his vows, speaking of loyalty, of love that endures through trials. Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the raw truth of how far we had come together. When it was my turn, I spoke clearly, letting each word settle in the room. I promised him not only love, but the strength to face whatever came for us next. The ceremony ended not with grandeur, but with a wave of relief. The applause was steady, some guests even rising to their feet, and for the first time that day, the smiles were genuine. Sophie jumped into my arms, her laughter ringing out like the truest blessing. I looked around at the people who had stayed, who had witnessed the chaos and still chosen to support us, and my heart swelled with gratitude. A week later, the headlines blazed across Boston. Local papers ran the story with words that made my chest tighten. Sister arrested by FBI after attempting to sabotage sibling's wedding. Amanda's face was everywhere, not smiling or triumphant as she had always tried to appear, but twisted with rage as the agents led her away. The fallout was swift. Her job in event planning was terminated, contracts dissolved, clients fled. The reputation she had guarded so fiercely collapsed in a matter of days. Richard and Evelyn disappeared from view, avoiding calls, keeping their blinds drawn at the house I had once called home. But the community knew, and the whispers followed them into church pews and grocery aisles. The favoritism that had been hidden behind closed doors was now public knowledge, and it carried a stench no one could ignore. For me, the days that followed were unexpectedly calm. Friends I had not heard from in years reached out with words of admiration. Colleagues stopped me in the hospital halls to say they were proud of me, that I had done what many could not. Nancy Collins published her article with precision, painting me not as a victim, but as a woman who had chosen to stand tall. One evening I sat in our small apartment, Sophie curled against me on the couch, her hair damp from her bath. She whispered that she was glad I had not given up. I kissed her forehead and told her we were free, now free from the weight of secrets and expectations that were never ours to bear. Daniel joined us, his arms circling my shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, I felt safe. I knew I'd lost my parents and my sister, but I had gained something greater. I had gained my voice, my dignity, and the certainty that Sophie would grow up knowing her mother never bowed to injustice. This was not the day I lost a family. This was the day I claimed justice and freedom for myself and my daughter. If you have ever faced betrayal or seen someone try to strip away your worth, tell me what gave you strength. Share your story because every truth spoken out loud has the power to free someone else.